I polished my shoes until they shone like a mirror, the leather catching the light from the bedroom window just so. Margaret would have scolded me for fussing so much, her soft laughter teasing me about acting like a young man again. The thought made my chest ache, but today wasn't about sadness. Today was Rachel's wedding, and I was determined to honor it the way Margaret would have wanted. I straightened my navy tie, the one she had picked out years ago, and shrugged into the deep navy suit she had always said made me look dashing. I smiled faintly at the mirror. A few more lines around the eyes, a little more silver at the temples, but I could almost hear her whispering that I looked sharp. That was enough to push me forward. The car ride to the reception hall was a blur of traffic and music on low volume, my mind floating somewhere between pride and an odd, nervous anticipation. Margaret and I had dreamed of this day, seeing Rachel walk down the aisle, building a life of her own. We had dreamed of family gathered together, love thick in the air like the scent of freshly baked bread. I carried those dreams with me into the grand hall, holding them close like fragile glass. At the entrance, a folding table was set up neatly with rows of name tags, each one glinting under the bright chandeliers. I smiled politely at the young woman handing them out, her bright red lipstick a stark contrast to her too wide smile. "Name?" she asked cheerfully, holding a clipboard. "Arthur Hayes," I said, my voice steady. She flipped through a few tags and plucked one up with a little flourish, pressing it into my hand with a wink like we shared some private joke. I glanced down automatically, expecting to see it printed in bold letters, "Arthur Hayes, grandfather of the bride." I deserved that title. Margaret would have insisted on it. But what I saw instead knocked the breath right out of me. In thick, black letters it read, "The old man who's paying for everything." For a moment, all the noise of the reception faded, the clinking glasses, the burst of laughter, the music swelling from the speakers, all of it fell away into a heavy, suffocating silence. My fingers tightened involuntarily around the tag. Surely this was a mistake. A cruel joke, maybe, one that someone would quickly apologize for, cheeks flushed with shame. I looked up, but the girl at the table had already turned away, handing out more tags, her mind somewhere else entirely. Behind me, a small cluster of guests chuckled. I couldn't tell if they were laughing at me or simply laughing because it was a wedding, and weddings were supposed to be joyful. It didn't matter. Their laughter buzzed against my skin like static electricity, sharp and irritating, filling my ears and making my heart thud painfully against my ribs. I stood frozen, the tag dangling from my hand, as the ugly truth settled itself deep inside me. They didn't see me as Rachel's grandfather, as the man who had rocked her to sleep when she was teething, who had taught her to ride a bike in the park, who had stood with tears streaming down his face the day she graduated from college. They didn't see me as the man who had held his family together after Margaret's death, who had quietly shouldered every burden so they wouldn't have to. They saw me as a wallet, a necessary but embarrassing relic, useful only for funding their dreams. My stomach twisted, but I forced a polite smile onto my face. I pinned the tag to my chest with fingers that barely trembled. Not here. Not now. Margaret wouldn't have wanted a scene. She would have wanted grace, dignity, composure. I drew a slow breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked into the reception hall as if the words on my chest didn't sting like acid. The room was beautiful, I had to admit. White tablecloths, gold-rimmed china, floral centerpieces so elaborate they looked like they belonged in a palace. A string quartet played softly in one corner, and fairy lights twinkled along the ceiling beams. Rachel had chosen well. She looked radiant as she moved from table to table, greeting guests with a wide, bright smile, her hand linked through her new husband's arm. I watched her from a distance, my heart both swelling and breaking at the same time. I thought of Margaret again, of how she would have beamed with pride, how she would have told everyone who would listen that our little girl had grown into such a fine woman. Margaret would have noticed the tag immediately. She would have marched right up to whoever made it and given them a piece of her mind, in that firm but graceful way only she could. I could almost hear her voice, fierce and protective. "Arthur is not an old man paying for everything. He is the reason you are all here." But Margaret wasn't here anymore. I was alone. I eased myself into a chair near the back of the room, away from the clusters of chattering guests. I needed a moment, just a moment, to gather myself. The laughter floated over to me again, and this time, I caught snippets, jokes about deep pockets and grand old sponsors. My chest tightened. I gripped the edges of the tablecloth, willing myself to stay calm. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Margaret and I had built this family with love, with sacrifices no one ever saw. I thought foolishly, maybe, that they understood, that they valued what we had given them. But as I sat there, the name tag burning like a brand against my suit, I realized something that cut deeper than any insult could have. The family I thought I had built didn't exist. At least, not in the way Margaret and I once dreamed. And that realization, that loss, was heavier than grief itself. I tried to brush it off. I pinned the tag firmly against my chest like armor, smiled at a few passing guests as if nothing were wrong, and pretended the bitter taste in my mouth was just nerves. Margaret used to say that dignity wasn't about how people treated you. It was about how you chose to respond. I clung to that now, white-knuckled, as I moved through the clusters of laughing faces, clinking glasses, and flashing cameras. It was Rachel's day, after all. I wouldn't tarnish it with my own wounded pride. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The string quartet swelled into a lively waltz as I wandered toward the outdoor patio, the cool evening air promising a brief escape. I passed servers balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, past groups of guests swapping stories and toasting to the happy couple, and for a fleeting moment, I convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it had been an ill-conceived joke, not malice. Maybe Margaret would tell me to let it go, to focus on the bigger picture. But then I heard it, my name, my own son's voice, clear as crystal slicing through the warm night air. "He's basically the family wallet," Derek said, laughing. I stopped dead, my feet rooted to the ground behind a row of potted ferns just outside the patio doors. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them, every careless word dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that didn't even bother to hide itself. "One more round on Grandpa." Serena's voice rang out, shrill and merry, followed by a chorus of laughter from their circle of friends. The words hit me like a slap. My throat tightened. I reached out, steadying myself against the rough stone wall, suddenly unsure if my legs would keep holding me up. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push away the hurt, but the sound of their laughter chased me down like a hound after wounded prey. I had paid for this entire event, not because anyone demanded it, but because I wanted to. Because Margaret would have wanted Rachel to have the kind of wedding she dreamed about, free of debt, free of worry. I had signed the checks without hesitation, quietly covering costs as they ballooned: the venue, the caterers, the custom floral arrangements, the open bar. I had smiled when Derek and Serena promised they would chip in where they could, though their contributions had been mostly suggestions and criticisms. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was a gift, given freely, without expectations. But it wasn't a gift to them. It was a resource to be drained. A joke. A fool's wallet. My fingers curled into a fist, nails digging into my palm until it hurt, grounding me in the moment. I stayed hidden behind the ferns, unseen, humiliated, listening as they moved on to other topics: vacation plans, a promotion Serena had secured, Derek's new boat. All paid for, no doubt, by the inheritance they had already counted on receiving someday. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just tonight. It wasn't just a name tag or an offhand joke. It was years. Years of entitlement. Years of seeing me not as a man, not as the father who raised Derek through scraped knees and bad report cards and broken hearts, but as a means to an end. I straightened slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket. The cool air bit at my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It cleared my mind, crystallizing a decision that had been hovering in the background for a long time, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Tonight was that moment. I thought of Margaret, of the nights we sat side by side in bed, her hand warm over mine as she talked about protecting the family, not just financially, but morally. About ensuring our legacy meant more than money in the bank. About love being something earned, not assumed. She had seen this possibility long before I did. Maybe part of her always knew Derek and Serena's hearts had shifted, that Rachel's affection was growing transactional. She had planted a safeguard in her will, a final net to catch me if I ever stumbled into denial too deep to escape. I slipped my hand into the inner pocket of my jacket and felt the crisp edge of the folded letter, Margaret's letter, resting there. It was a heavy thing, heavier than any bank draft or legal document I had ever signed. Tonight, that weight shifted from a burden to a weapon. Not out of vengeance. Out of necessity. I stepped back into the hall, head high, spine straight, my heartbeat steady and resolved. I found a passing server and plucked a glass of champagne from their tray. I sipped slowly, letting the bitter bubbles sting my tongue. Around me, the party raged on. Rachel twirled in the center of the dance floor, her dress fanning out like a spun sugar confection. Derek and Serena toasted with their friends, utterly unaware that the foundation of their expectations was about to collapse beneath them. I caught my reflection in one of the gilded mirrors lining the reception hall, a dignified man in a sharp navy suit, silver hair neatly combed, eyes clearer now than they had been in years. They could laugh all they wanted. They could call me a wallet, an old man, a relic. But tonight, they would learn. They would remember. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt Margaret beside me, not as a memory, but as a presence, strong and unyielding. Her final gift, waiting to be unwrapped. I raised my glass slightly toward my reflection and gave a small nod, a silent promise whispered between me and the woman who had never let me falter. Tonight, the reckoning would begin. It wasn't until after Margaret's funeral, on a quiet, overcast afternoon when the world felt stripped of color, that I learned just how far she had gone to protect me. Eli Franklin, her longtime attorney and an old friend of ours, had invited me to his office under the pretense of finalizing paperwork. I remember sitting there, numb and mechanical, signing where he pointed, nodding where he spoke. My mind was adrift, still reaching for Margaret's hand in the darkness she left behind. It was only when the formalities were done, when the polished surface of grief was peeled back by Eli's uncharacteristically somber expression, that he slid a small, leather-bound folder across the desk toward me. "There's something Margaret wanted you to have," he said quietly. "Not for now, but for when it's needed." I remember how my fingers hesitated over the folder. It felt sacred somehow, like touching it would break a spell. I opened it carefully, the paper inside heavy and thick. Margaret's handwriting unmistakable, neat, deliberate, full of the same grace she had carried through her life. Inside was a letter, a clause, a safeguard. Any descendant who humiliates or disrespects Arthur will be disinherited immediately. The words stared up at me, simple and brutal in their precision. I read them once, twice, a third time, my heart thudding louder with each pass. Margaret had seen it, hadn't she? The cracks that I had pretended were just stress, just youth, just misunderstanding. She had recognized what I refused to name, that love given freely could sometimes turn into expectation, into entitlement, into cruelty. At the bottom of the page was a note, scribbled hastily, almost as an afterthought, but the words carried the full weight of her spirit. "Arthur, if they love you, truly love you, they will never trigger this. If they don't, then you must protect yourself. Promise me you will." I had promised, sitting there in Eli's office, the paper trembling between my hands. I had sworn silently, through gritted teeth and misted eyes, that I would honor her final request, that I would not let grief make me blind, that I would not let them, if they chose cruelty, tarnish everything Margaret and I had built. For years, the letter had remained hidden away, tucked into the safe at home, buried beneath layers of insurance policies and birth certificates, gathering dust. A silent guardian. A weapon I prayed I would never need. But tonight, as the champagne flowed and the laughter at my expense rolled through the halls like a bitter tide, I knew it was time. Margaret's gift wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about dignity, about reclaiming it when those who should have honored it forgot themselves. As the night unfurled around me, I slipped away from the crowd and found a small, dimly lit alcove near the restrooms. I pulled the folded letter from my pocket and smoothed it open carefully, reverently. Even in the low light, Margaret's handwriting was steady and clear, her voice echoing off the page with a strength that shamed my earlier hesitation. I read the clause again, word by word, tasting each syllable like a bitter medicine. Then I folded it and slipped it back into my jacket. My decision was no longer a question. It was a certainty. I caught a glimpse of Eli across the room, his dark suit blending with the crowds of chattering guests. He stood near the bar, sipping club soda, ever the quiet observer. When our eyes met, he gave me the smallest of nods, just enough to tell me he understood, just enough to remind me that I wasn't alone. The comfort of that was more profound than I expected. In a room full of people who had spent the evening laughing at my expense, it mattered more than I could say to know that someone still stood with me, that Margaret still stood with me, in her way. The evening pressed on. The string quartet transitioned into a lively pop song, a nod to the younger guests, and the dance floor filled with bodies swaying awkwardly between generations. I watched Rachel spin in her white dress, laughing into her husband's shoulder, and for a flicker of a moment, the old pride rose again, unbidden. She was still my granddaughter. Somewhere inside her must still be the little girl who once clutched my hand crossing busy streets, who shrieked with laughter when I chased her through autumn leaves. But the memory of her laughing tonight, laughing at me, soured that moment, turned it brittle and sharp. I could not save who she used to be. I could only respond to who she had chosen to become. When they finally called for toasts, I moved with slow deliberation to the head table. My feet felt heavy, but my heart was lighter than it had been in months, maybe years. The folded letter burned like a brand against my chest, a reminder that this moment was not about anger. It was about truth. I knew what Margaret would want. Not revenge, but clarity. Not hatred, but justice. She had given me the words. Now, it was time to speak them. As the microphone was passed around, each speaker offered the usual platitudes about love, about future happiness, about partnership and trust. I listened quietly, one hand resting over my heart, feeling the reassuring pressure of Margaret's letter beneath my palm. When my name was called, when the crowd turned expectantly toward me, I rose slowly from my chair, steady despite the tremor I could feel deep in my bones. I took the microphone with a small smile, letting my gaze sweep across the room. Derek and Serena still flush from laughter, Rachel radiant and unknowing, guests oblivious and buzzing with wine and good cheer. I cleared my throat, my voice low and calm. Before we raise our glasses, I said, I have one final message. I slipped the letter from my jacket, unfolding it carefully with fingers that no longer shook. It was time. Margaret's hidden gift was about to change everything. The cocktail hour buzzed with the kind of energy only weddings and open bars could conjure, a bright, frothy atmosphere of laughter, tinkling glasses, and polite bragging about jobs, vacations, and whose children were doing better than whose. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling, shaking hands, posing for photos when asked. The camera flashes caught the deep lines around my mouth and the gray at my temples, but I smiled anyway, as if I were oblivious to the whispering, the jokes, the slow, steady erosion of respect that had been happening right under my nose. Inside, though, I was waiting with the patience of a man who had built a life brick by brick, who understood that timing was everything. I wasn't going to rage or storm or make a scene fueled by emotion. No, Margaret had taught me better. When you needed to make a point, you didn't shout. You made them feel it, deep enough that it settled under their skin and stayed there. My hand kept brushing against the folded letter inside my jacket, a silent reassurance. The weight of it was grounding, a reminder of why I was here tonight, why I would endure every smile, every false toast, every hollow thank you that hid the snickering underneath. This wasn't about my pride anymore. It was about Margaret's legacy, about the promises we made to each other and to ourselves. I accepted another glass of champagne from a passing server, nodding politely, and sipped it without really tasting it. Across the ballroom, a small group had gathered near the raised dais where the toast would be given. Rachel stood front and center, her white gown cascading around her like a cloud. She was laughing at something her new husband, Thomas, whispered into her ear. The sight should have filled me with joy, but the earlier sting of overheard words still pulsed like a fresh bruise. When Thomas tapped his glass with a fork, drawing the room's attention, the buzz of conversation softened to a murmur and then a hush. Rachel beamed, cheeks flushed with excitement and maybe a little champagne, as they prepared to make their speech. Thomas spoke first, his voice bright, full of the confidence of a young man whose life was only beginning. He thanked his parents, his friends, the bridal party. Then he turned, sweeping a hand dramatically toward me. And, of course, he said, a special thanks to the generous old man who made all this possible. The crowd erupted into a round of laughter, light-hearted, good-natured on the surface, but laced with something meaner underneath, something thoughtless and cutting. I felt it like a cold slap across the face. My fingers tightened around the stem of the champagne glass, and for a split second, I thought about hurling it to the ground just to hear it shatter, just to drown out the laughter. But I didn't. I set the glass carefully on a nearby table, wiped my hands against the sides of my jacket, and let my expression remain calm, unbothered. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, a steady drumbeat reminding me to hold steady, hold firm. The folded letter shifted slightly inside my jacket as if Margaret herself were nudging me, reminding me, not yet. Wait, make it count. From across the room, I caught Eli Franklin's gaze. He was standing with a small group of guests, a club soda in hand, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him well. But I saw it, the faint narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Rachel and Thomas finished their toast, glasses clinking, and the DJ announced that dinner would be served shortly. Guests began to drift toward their tables, still buzzing with laughter and chatter, oblivious to the shift that was about to crack the evening wide open. I moved slowly through the crowd, every step deliberate. I paused here and there to murmur a kind word, to shake a hand, to thank a guest for coming. From the outside, I must have looked every bit the proud grandfather, dignified, gracious, a man savoring the culmination of a lifetime's work. But inside, I was clearing the stage. When I finally reached the head table, Rachel turned toward me, her smile wide and expectant. "Grandpa," she said, reaching for me. "Wasn't that funny? We're so lucky to have you." Lucky. As if I were a lottery ticket they had cashed long ago. I leaned down and kissed her cheek lightly, the way I used to when she was a little girl. Her skin smelled of roses and expensive perfume, but it couldn't cover the hollowness that now sat between us. I straightened and stepped back, adjusting the lapel of my jacket, my fingers brushing the edge of the letter one more time. There was no announcement, no fanfare. I simply moved toward the microphone at the front of the dais, my steps slow but unyielding. The chatter in the room began to die down as people noticed me. A few scattered claps, polite and confused, echoed through the hall. I wrapped my fingers around the microphone stand and looked out over the sea of faces, family, friends, strangers. Some smiling, some indifferent, a few already shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as if they could sense the coming storm. "Before we raise our glasses," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the murmurs, "I have one last message." I reached into my jacket, pulled out the letter, and carefully unfolded it. The room held its breath. Margaret's words, written in her careful, graceful hand, waited on the page. And I was ready to deliver them. The weight of the microphone in my hand felt heavier than I remembered, or maybe it was just the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. I smoothed the letter between my fingers one last time, feeling the ridges of Margaret's handwriting beneath my touch. The room had fallen into a thick, uncomfortable silence, the kind that made people shift in their seats and glance nervously at one another, wondering if they had missed some invisible cue. I took a slow breath, filling my lungs with the scent of champagne, peonies, and expensive perfume. Then I began. "Before we raise our glasses," I said, my voice cutting clean through the stillness, "I would like to share something from someone who, though she is no longer here in body, remains here in spirit." A ripple went through the crowd at that, a few soft murmurs, some nods. They were expecting a touching tribute to Margaret, perhaps a few tender words that would leave them misty-eyed and grateful to have witnessed such enduring love. How little they knew. I unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately, giving the moment the weight it deserved. The paper crackled softly as I smoothed it against the podium, the sound sharp and crisp in the quiet. "This," I said, glancing down at the familiar script, "is Margaret's final gift. Not just to me, but to all of you." I began to read. At first, the words were simple: Margaret's gratitude for those who had shown kindness, her hope that the family would continue to honor the values she and I had tried to instill: love, loyalty, respect. Heads nodded. Faces softened. They leaned in, lulled by the familiar cadence of a eulogy. And then I reached the heart of it, the part Margaret had written not in sentiment, but in steel. "In the event that any descendant of mine should humiliate or disrespect Arthur Hayes," I read, my voice steady, unwavering, "they shall be immediately and permanently disinherited. Without exception, without appeal." The words hung in the air like smoke, twisting, blackening the atmosphere. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, followed by a stunned, disbelieving silence. I let it sit there, let them feel the full weight of what had been said, what had been waiting for them in ink and in tint all these years. I looked up from the letter, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the crowd. Derek's face had drained of all color, the easy grin wiped away as if it had never existed. His hand gripped the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles shone white. Beside him, Serena coughed violently into her champagne glass, nearly doubling over as she struggled to compose herself. Rachel stood frozen, her bright smile still plastered awkwardly on her face, as if she hadn't yet fully processed what was happening. "Good," I thought grimly. "Let it sink in." I continued reading, laying out the specifics Margaret had so carefully crafted. There would be no loopholes, no technicalities to worm through. Disrespect was defined clearly, and public humiliation, like what had happened tonight, what they had done with thoughtless cruelty, fell squarely within it. Eli Franklin stepped forward from his place near the bar, a thick envelope tucked under his arm. He cleared his throat politely, drawing every eye in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice professional but edged with steel, "my office has been authorized to enforce this clause immediately. Documentation will be delivered to the relevant parties in the coming days." He didn't have to say more. The implication was clear. Derek, Serena, Rachel, their inheritance, The future they had so comfortably planned around was gone. I folded Margaret's letter carefully and slipped it back into my jacket. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the silence stretch and deepen until it was almost unbearable. Then I raised my champagne glass, the gesture slow and deliberate. To Margaret, I said, my voice firm. May we honor her memory, not with empty words, but with true respect. I took a slow sip from my glass, the champagne bitter and strangely satisfying on my tongue. Around the room, some guests followed suit hesitantly, their faces wary, confused. Others simply stared, mouths slightly open, as if unsure whether clapping would be appropriate or if it would only make things worse. The damage was done. The truth had been spoken. The reckoning had arrived. I returned the microphone to its stand with a soft click and stepped down from the dais, my every movement measured, composed. I didn't hurry. I didn't gloat. I simply walked back to my table as if nothing extraordinary had happened, even though the world around me had shifted on its axis. As I moved through the sea of stunned faces, I caught glimpses of whispered conversations, of hurried, frantic texts being tapped out under tables. Derek was already on his feet, face red, gesturing wildly at Eli. Serena looked like she might cry, her perfectly applied makeup cracking at the corners of her eyes. Rachel remained rooted to her spot, pale and trembling, as if one wrong move would shatter her into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I sat down at my table, picked up my napkin, and placed it calmly across my lap. A server approached with a questioning look, and I nodded politely for dinner to proceed. Outside the ballroom, the world went on. Cars drove past, the city lights flickered, the air carried the first hints of a cool evening breeze. Inside, however, everything had changed. Margaret had made sure of it, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Justice, long deferred, had finally arrived. The silence didn't shatter all at once. It fractured slowly, like a sheet of ice under too much weight. First a few murmured conversations, then the sharp scrape of a chair being pushed back, and then the rising swell of confusion, panic, and disbelief. I sat at my table, a quiet island in the midst of a storm I had deliberately unleashed. I watched it unfold, steady and composed, because Margaret had taught me long ago, when the truth finally comes, you don't run from it. You let it burn clean. Derek was the first to move. He stormed toward Eli, his fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted into a furious, almost childish mask of outrage. I could hear him from across the room, his voice sharp and desperate, slicing